They said she was only a tag-along, a shadow drifting at the edges of others' lives, a girl who seemed too quiet, too meek, too unremarkable to ever command attention. In the training camps she was the one dismissed, the one told to stay behind while the stronger recruits went forward, the one whispered about when rations were handed out because no one could understand why she had been brought into the resistance in the first place. Her name was Elira, and in those early days the sound of it was often spoken with derision, as if it carried no weight at all, as if it was destined to fade into silence. She carried those words quietly, never protesting, never snapping back at the mocking laughter or the pointed remarks. She would simply lower her eyes, press her lips into a thin line and move on, her small frame slipping unnoticed between tents, her hands busy with chores others had grown too proud to take seriously. She cooked, she stitched torn uniforms, she carried ammunition crates that looked far too heavy for her slight body, and she listened. Always listening. No one noticed how closely she observed the training sessions, how she memorized every command, every movement, every mistake. They saw only a tag-along, someone harmless and small. What they did not see was the storm quietly building in her heart. The war had not been kind to her. Long before she set foot in the camp, she had known loss in its rawest, most merciless form. The enemy had taken her family, burning her village to the ground and leaving her with nothing but ash and memories. She had survived only because she had hidden beneath the floorboards of her home, pressing her fists against her mouth to keep from making a sound while the screams of her neighbors filled the air. When she emerged, the world she had known was gone, and what remained of her innocence burned away with the embers. From that night on she had carried a quiet vow inside her chest, a promise that no matter how small, how weak, how overlooked she might seem, she would never again allow herself to stand by helplessly. But vows spoken in silence are not enough to convince others, and so in the camp she endured the sting of ridicule, each insult a weight pressing heavier on her shoulders, each dismissal a reminder of the distance she had yet to climb. Yet in the darkness of night, when the campfires dimmed and even the loudest voices fell into sleep, she trained alone. With a rusted blade salvaged from the ruins of her home, she practiced movements she had seen the soldiers repeat, slow and steady at first, then faster, sharper, until the cuts of her arm became fluid arcs in the moonlight. Her body bore bruises from her clumsy beginnings, but she welcomed them as proof that she was not as fragile as they thought. She ran the perimeter of the camp when others slept, pushing her lungs until they burned, forcing her legs to carry her farther each night. She was relentless, driven not by glory but by the memory of flames consuming everything she had loved. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still she was treated as background noise, a body that existed but did not matter. And yet, it was in those long, invisible months that she built herself into something unrecognizable. The moment of change came not with ceremony but with chaos. An ambush shattered the quiet routine of the camp one dawn, when the enemy swept down with a ferocity none had expected. Soldiers scrambled, shouts ripped through the morning air, and fire lit the edges of the horizon. In the panic, orders grew muddled and formations broke. Elira, who had been carrying supplies near the perimeter, found herself at the center of the storm. No one called her name, no one told her where to run, and for the first time she did not wait for instruction. As arrows hissed through the air and steel clashed around her, something within her ignited. She moved with a swiftness that startled even herself, seizing a fallen spear and hurling it into the chest of an enemy soldier who had broken through the line. There was no hesitation, no trembling of her hands, only a calm clarity, as though her body had long been preparing for this moment. Those who witnessed it would later speak in disbelief, insisting their memories must have been warped by the chaos, because the girl they had dismissed could not possibly have stood against armed men. But she had, and when the enemy pressed harder, she pressed back with a fury that seemed far too large for her small frame. She fought not like a recruit but like a force of nature unleashed. The ambush was repelled, but not without heavy losses. When the dust settled, the camp was a scarred shadow of what it had been hours before. Amid the wreckage, survivors gathered, shaken and grieving, and among them stood Elira, her hands stained with blood that was not her own, her eyes still burning with the fire of the fight. For the first time, silence fell when her name was spoken, not because it was unworthy, but because it now carried weight, carried the memory of the morning when a tag-along had turned the tide of death. And yet even then she did not bask in their awe. She simply lowered her eyes as she always had, her lips pressing into that same thin line, and went to work tending the wounded, her touch steady despite the tremor that still lingered in her muscles. In the days that followed, whispers spread beyond the camp. Stories grew, carried by frightened prisoners and shaken scouts, until the enemy themselves began to murmur about the small girl with the unflinching gaze, the one who moved like a shadow and struck with the precision of a hawk. They did not know her name then, but the weight of her presence haunted them. Alira did not seek those stories, did not care for them. She only continued to train, to fight, to bear the burden of survival. And slowly, those who once laughed at her began to watch her with a mix of unease and respect. They had called her a tag-along, but on the battlefield even the bravest enemy would soon learn to tremble at the sound of her name. The ambush changed everything, not only for Alira but for those who had once seen her as little more than a burden. Suddenly the camp looked at her differently, though they struggled to put words to what they felt. She was still the same small figure moving silently among them, still the girl who cooked meals and patched torn sleeves, but now her presence carried an unspoken gravity, a weight that no one could deny. The commanders avoided admitting that they had misjudged her, but their eyes followed her more closely during training drills, and their tone softened slightly when they spoke her name. Some of the younger recruits began to mimic her, running the perimeter at night or practicing their blade work when they thought no one was watching, inspired by the discovery that strength did not always announce itself in loud voices or broad shoulders. Yet Alira herself did not feel changed. She carried no pride, no desire to bask in the respect she had suddenly earned. Inside her, the same vow burned quietly, and she knew that the ambush was only the beginning. The enemy had tested their defenses and they would come again, stronger, more prepared, determined to crush the resistance before it could rise. She could not allow herself to relax, not even for a moment. So while others healed and rebuilt, she sharpened her blade until it gleamed in the firelight and studied the maps the commanders spread over their tables, memorizing the terrain with a focus that few noticed. Her ears caught every fragment of strategy, every whispered doubt, every plan that faltered before it was spoken aloud. She became a shadow not only on the battlefield but in the very heart of the camp, absorbing knowledge that would one day matter far more than any of them realized. It was during those weeks that Alira began to understand fear not as a weakness but as a tool. She saw how the mere mention of her actions during the ambush spread through enemy lines, twisting into legend faster than truth could catch up. They whispered about a girl with fire in her eyes who had cut through armored soldiers as though they were straw men, a phantom who appeared where she was least expected and disappeared before arrows could reach her. The stories grew larger than life, and though Alira knew the reality had been less spectacular, she did not dismiss the power of these tales. Fear could shatter an enemy before swords even clashed, and she began to shape her movements to feed that fear. When raids were planned against enemy supply lines, she volunteered silently, her presence at first ignored, then reluctantly accepted and finally requested. In the darkness of night she slipped through shadows with the raiding parties, striking swiftly and vanishing before alarms could spread. It was in those missions that her name began to take root, whispered first among the resistance and then feared by the soldiers they opposed. Alira. A name that had once been spoken only with derision now carried the weight of warning. And still she never sought recognition. When the raiding parties returned triumphant, she would fade into the background, tending to her weapons, cleaning the grime from her hands, her gaze always on the horizon where the next battle would come. Some of the men tried to befriend her, to draw her into the circle of laughter that always formed around victory, but she remained distant, her words few, her smile rare. It was not disdain that kept her apart but the quiet knowledge that attachment was dangerous. She had lost too much already and she could not afford to lose again. Yet in her silence, there was something that drew others to her. They began to look to her not as a comrade but as a figure larger than themselves, someone who embodied the unyielding strength they all wished to possess. They followed her not because she demanded it but because she inspired it, without even trying. The enemy, however, felt her rise more keenly than anyone else. Reports reached their generals of convoys vanishing, of patrols cut down in the dark, of men who swore they had seen a girl's eyes blazing like fire just before their comrades fell. They began to tighten their defenses, doubling their guards, shifting their strategies, yet still the strikes continued. Each failure planted seeds of doubt in their ranks, and those seeds grew into fear that no commander's speech could uproot. The enemy trembled at shadows, at the sound of twigs snapping in the night, at the rustle of wind through leaves, convinced that she was near. To them she became less a soldier and more a specter, an omen of death. But Alira herself never thought of such things. In her mind, she was still the girl from the ruined village, still the child hiding beneath the floorboards, still the tag-along who had been mocked for her weakness. The only difference was that she had chosen never to remain helpless again. Her fight was not for glory, not for fear, not even for revenge anymore. It was for the simple vow that no one else would endure the silence she had endured, the silence of watching everything burn. One night, after another successful raid, she sat apart from the others, her blade across her knees, when an older commander approached. He was a man hardened by years of battle, his face carved with lines of loss, his voice roughened by too many orders shouted across bloodied fields. He stood silently for a long time before speaking, his eyes fixed on her with a strange blend of respect and unease. "They fear you," he said at last, his words low, almost reluctant. "Even our own men. They call you a shadow, a phantom. Do you know what that means?" Elira's gaze did not lift from the blade in her hands as she answered simply, "It means they will think twice before coming again." The commander studied her, perhaps expecting more, perhaps hoping for some trace of arrogance or pride, but finding none. At last he nodded and walked away, and Elira was left alone with the firelight flickering across her face, her expression unreadable. In the silence, she whispered the names of those she had lost, one by one as she always did, her vow renewed with every breath. They had called her a tag-along, and perhaps in their eyes she always would be, but she knew now that her path had never been to follow, it had always been to carve a trail so sharp and so unrelenting that the enemy would tremble long before they ever saw her face. The resistance grew bolder as weeks turned into months, and with every victory Elira's presence seemed to loom larger over both allies and enemies. Her name spread not through proclamations but through whispers carried from campfires to villages, from survivors to refugees, from terrified prisoners who spoke of her with wide eyes and trembling voices. To some, she was a savior, proof that even the smallest among them could rise against tyranny. To others she was an omen, a reminder that death could come swiftly and silently in the dark. Elira herself tried to ignore these stories, but she could not escape them. When she entered a room, conversations faltered, eyes shifted, and silence followed her like a shadow. She had once been invisible, unseen, unwanted, but now she found herself under a light she had never sought. It made her restless, uneasy, for she did not crave recognition. She craved only the strength to keep her vow. Yet war is not patient, and soon her strength was tested again. The enemy, driven by their growing fear, launched a massive offensive against the resistance. They did not come in scattered ambushes or isolated patrols this time but as a full force, determined to crush the rebels once and for all. Their banners blackened the horizon, their horns echoed through the valleys, and their soldiers marched with grim determination. The resistance camp trembled with the weight of what was coming, for they had never faced such numbers before. Commanders barked frantic orders, soldiers scrambled to fortify their defenses, and fear ran like cold water through every tent. In the midst of this storm, Elira stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy banners rippled like dark wings. She felt no fear for herself, only for the people around her, the ones who had once mocked her but who now looked to her with desperate, pleading eyes. She had never asked to be their hope, but somehow she had become it, and she knew she could not let them down. When the battle came, it came like thunder. Arrows rained from the sky, steel clashed against steel, and the earth shook beneath the trampling of thousands of feet. The resistance line bent beneath the weight of the assault, men and women falling one after another, cries of pain rising into the air. For a moment it seemed as though the camp would be swallowed whole, that the resistance would break and be scattered like leaves before a storm. And then Elira moved. She surged into the fray not with reckless fury but with a calm, unyielding focus that drew every eye. Her blade flashed in the smoke, cutting through armored foes as though the steel itself obeyed her will. She moved with precision, each strike deliberate, each step purposeful, weaving through chaos as though the battlefield were nothing more than the training ground she had carved for herself in the dead of night. To those who fought beside her, she was a beacon, proof that they could still stand. To those who faced her, she was terror incarnate, a figure too fast, too sharp, too relentless to be anything but a nightmare. The enemy pressed harder, but wherever she appeared, their momentum faltered. Soldiers who had once charged with confidence now hesitated, their eyes darting nervously, their weapons trembling. They whispered her name even as they fought, Elira, as though saying it aloud might banish the fear gnawing at their hearts. But the name only grew heavier, more suffocating, until the mere sound of it seemed to break them. Yet even as she fought, Elira's thoughts were not of herself. She thought of the village that had burned, of the voices that had been silenced, of the vow she had carried since the night she lost everything. Every swing of her blade was for them, every drop of sweat and blood was for the promise that no one else would endure what she had endured. She fought for the children who hid in ruins, for the mothers who wept over graves, for the nameless dead who deserved to be remembered. And as the hours dragged on and the battle raged without end, her body screamed with exhaustion, but she did not falter. She could not. By dusk, the battlefield was a wasteland of broken banners and lifeless bodies. The resistance had held, though at a terrible cost. Their dead lay in rows, their wounded moaned in pain, but the enemy had been forced to retreat, leaving behind their weapons and their pride. And at the center of it all stood Alira, her clothes torn, her skin streaked with blood, her blade dulled by the countless lives it had taken. The survivors gathered around her, some too weary to speak, others murmuring her name with awe and disbelief. They had won not because they were stronger or more prepared, but because she had refused to break, and her refusal had become their own. That night, as the camp mourned and tended to its wounded, the commanders called a council. For the first time, Alira was summoned to sit among them, no longer as a servant or a silent observer but as an equal, a voice to be heard. She listened quietly as they debated their next move, their voices heavy with the weight of loss and the uncertainty of tomorrow. When at last they turned to her, asking what she thought, she spoke with the same calm simplicity that had carried her through every trial. "They fear us now," she said. "We must not give them time to forget that fear." Her words silenced the tent. Hardened warriors who had spent their lives commanding armies found themselves nodding, not because her voice was loud or commanding, but because it was steady, unshaken, and filled with truth. From that night onward, Alira was no longer dismissed as a tag-along. She was a leader, though she never claimed the title, guiding them not with speeches or orders but with her example, her relentless dedication, and her unbreakable vow. Beyond the camp, her legend grew darker. The enemy, humiliated by their defeat, painted her as a demon, a curse upon their armies. They spread tales of her ruthlessness, her inhuman speed, her merciless strikes. Yet these stories only deepened the fear that gripped their soldiers, until entire units trembled at the thought of facing her. For Alira the stories meant nothing. She carried no joy in their fear, no satisfaction in her reputation. She carried only the memory of ashes and the vow that had become her very heartbeat. She had been called a tag-along, and perhaps once that was true, but now her footsteps carved paths that armies dared not follow, and the sound of her name alone was enough to make the enemy tremble. Winter descended upon the land with a merciless grip, turning the hills and forests into a frozen wasteland where every breath hung like smoke in the air and every movement was slowed by biting winds. For the resistance it was both a curse and a shield. The enemy, desperate to reclaim their pride after being driven back, sent smaller patrols and raiding parties through the snow, but the cold sapped their strength, and the fear of Alira's shadow weighed heavily upon them. Rumors now painted her as death itself, gliding silently through the snowdrifts, her blade flashing like ice under the moonlight. Soldiers who had once marched with arrogance now whispered prayers before stepping beyond their gates, knowing that the winter belonged not to them but to the ghost who haunted their every path. Within the resistance camp, life was grimmer than ever. Supplies ran low, fires burned small, and hunger hollowed faces that had once carried the glow of defiance. The victories had come at a cost, and the survivors carried those losses heavily. Alira moved quietly among them, her own body weakened by the cold but her resolve unbroken. She shared her rations with those who needed them more, carried wood when others could not, and stood guard through the long nights when the icy winds threatened to put out even the strongest flames. To the others, her endurance was another mystery, another reason to see her as more than human. But Alira knew the truth. Every night she closed her eyes, she dreamed of fire and ashes, of her family's voices crying out, and she woke with the taste of smoke in her mouth. It was not strength that drove her but the weight of memory, the vow that never let her rest. The enemy soon discovered that fear could cripple them as much as cold. Convoys disappeared in the snow, their wagons burned, their supplies scattered. Patrols returned shattered, speaking of ambushes where they never saw the faces of those who struck. And always, the name Alira was spoken in hushed tones, as though uttering it too loudly might summon her. Commanders in distant halls debated whether she was a myth, an invention of desperate rebels to frighten their enemies, but the soldiers who survived swore otherwise. They described her eyes burning through the storm, her blade moving with a speed no man could match, her figure melting into the night before arrows could reach her. Some even claimed she was not a girl at all but a spirit born from the suffering of the oppressed, a wraith that could not be killed. Alira herself ignored these stories for she had no time for legends. Her concern was survival, not only her own but of those who had chosen to fight beside her. Yet she could not help but notice how those around her had changed. Where once they had doubted her, now they leaned on her, looked to her not just for strength but for hope. Her silence had become a language of its own, every glance and gesture carrying weight, every movement studied and mirrored by those who wished to follow her path. She had never asked for leadership, but leadership had found her, and she carried it with the same quiet determination she carried her blade. One night, as snow drifted heavily from the sky and the camp huddled in shivering silence, scouts returned with dire news. A massive enemy force had established a stronghold deep in the valley, stockpiling supplies and preparing for a renewed assault once the thaw came. If left unchecked, it would crush the resistance in the spring. Fear rippled through the camp, voices rising in panic, arguments sparking over what little could be done. The commanders spoke of retreat, of hiding until the storm passed. But Elira listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the maps spread across the table. She saw the stronghold not as an untouchable fortress but as a wound waiting to be cut open. If they believe spring will bring their strength, we must take it from them before the snow melts, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye turning toward her. The tent fell silent. Some scoffed at the idea of striking such a fortress, but others, remembering the battles she had led them through, felt their doubts waver. She spoke no grand speech, offered no promises of easy victory, only the simple truth that if they did nothing they would perish. And so, against their fear they listened. The days that followed were brutal. Elira led small groups through the frozen forests, striking supply wagons before they reached the stronghold, cutting down outposts, unraveling the threads that fed the enemy's power. Each raid was swift and merciless, each retreat vanishing into the snow before the enemy could mount a counterattack. She studied the stronghold from every angle, memorizing the movements of guards, the patterns of patrols, the weaknesses in their defenses. To those who followed her, it seemed as though she could see the battlefield with eyes that pierced beyond walls, as though nothing could be hidden from her gaze. When the time finally came, she stood before her weary comrades, her cloak heavy with frost, her blade sharpened against the stone. She spoke only once. Tonight they believe themselves safe. Tomorrow they will remember us forever. And with those words she led them into the snow. The assault was a storm of shadows. Under cover of night and wind, the resistance slipped through the weak points Elira had studied so carefully. They moved like wolves among sheep, silent and swift, cutting down guards before cries could be raised, setting fire to the stockpiled supplies that had been meant to feed an army. Panic erupted within the stronghold, soldiers stumbling through smoke and flame, their formation crumbling as they searched for an enemy that struck and vanished like ghosts. And at the heart of it all was Elira, her blade singing through the dark, her presence felt even when she was unseen. The enemy cried her name in terror, believing she was everywhere at once, striking from shadows too deep to be pierced. By dawn, the stronghold was reduced to ruin, its banners burned, its stores destroyed. The resistance slipped away into the snow, leaving behind only wreckage and fear. The enemy's dreams of spring dominance lay in ashes, and their soldiers carried back only tales of the girl whose shadow had turned the tide of war. In the aftermath, as her comrades whispered of miracles and legends, Elira sat alone by the dying embers of a fire, her hands trembling though her face remained calm. She felt no triumph, only the weight of what had been done, the blood on her hands, the vow that still bound her to a path with no end. They had once called her a tagalong, and perhaps she had been trailing behind others without notice. But now she knew there was no one ahead to follow. She had become the path itself, and behind her marched not shadows of scorn but an army whose faith rested on her shoulders. While the enemy trembled at the mere sound of her name, spring came at last, but it did not bring peace. The snow melted into rivers of mud, the forests filled with the cries of birds returning to their nests, and the land that had been silent under winter's weight awoke with the roar of armies preparing to clash once more. The enemy, humiliated by the destruction of their stronghold, gathered forces from every corner of their territory, swelling their numbers until their banners darkened the hills like a storm cloud. They could no longer ignore the resistance, nor dismiss Elira as a mere nuisance, for her name had become a curse whispered in their barracks, a shadow that haunted their sleep. This time they meant to end it, to crush not only the fighters who defied them but the legend itself. Within the resistance camp, the air was thick with both fear and determination. Survivors of the winter raids bore scars upon their bodies and their hearts, yet they stood straighter when Elira walked among them, their eyes finding courage in the quiet steadiness of her presence. She did not shout commands or inspire with fiery speeches, but with every step she took, every scar she carried without complaint, she reminded them that endurance itself could be stronger than fear. She had become their anchor, the silent flame that would not be extinguished. The commander spoke of strategies, of ambushes and traps, of delaying the enemy until reinforcements might come, but Elira listened in silence, her gaze never leaving the maps spread before them. She could see the truth written in ink and parchment, The resistance was outnumbered, outmatched, and outsupplied. To fight on the enemy's terms would mean annihilation. When at last the arguments subsided, her voice cut through the tent, soft but unwavering. We cannot meet them head-on. If they see us as shadows, then we must remain shadows. Let them swing at air until their strength is gone, and then we strike where they are weakest. Some scoffed, unwilling to surrender the pride of open battle, but others nodded, remembering the winter, remembering how her raids had bled the enemy without mercy. In the end they agreed, not because she commanded it but because they trusted her, more than they trusted their own fear. And so began the long campaign of shadows. 4 weeks, the resistance harried the enemy's vast army, striking supply lines, setting traps in narrow passes, luring patrols into ambushes where none returned. They became a phantom force, impossible to pin down, vanishing into the forest before counterattacks could strike. And at the heart of it all was Elira, her eyes unyielding, her blade sharp, her silence carrying more weight than any battle cry. The enemy cursed her name, swearing vengeance, but every attempt to corner her forces ended in disaster. Every night their soldiers huddled in fear, listening for footsteps that might come for them in the dark. Yet the war was not without cost. The resistance bled too with every strike. Friends fell, comrades were buried in shallow graves, and each victory was bought with pain. Elira carried these losses heavily, her heart aching with the weight of every name whispered into the night. She never allowed herself to weep where others could see, but when she sat alone, she would press her forehead against her blade and let the silence of the dead wash over her. Each loss reminded her of the night her village burned, each face another voice added to the vow that had carried her this far. It hardened her resolve but deepened her loneliness, for the more her comrades looked to her as their hope, the less she felt she belonged among them. She had become something different, something set apart, and though they loved her for it, it left her isolated in a way no one could touch. As the campaign dragged on, the enemy's frustration grew into desperation. Their generals, once confident in crushing the rebellion, now struggled to maintain control over soldiers who trembled at shadows. Morale rotted like fruit left too long in the sun, and the name Elira became poison in their ranks. Some refused to march when rumors spread that she had been sighted nearby, others fled into the night, abandoning their posts rather than risk facing her. Still, the generals pressed forward, their pride wounded too deeply to retreat. They set a trap of their own, spreading false information that a massive supply convoy would be traveling through the valley, bait for the resistance who could not resist such an opportunity. Scouts carried the news back to camp and debates erupted. Many saw it as the chance to deal a crippling blow, to seize supplies that could keep them alive for months. But Elira's eyes narrowed as she listened, her instincts coiling tight with unease. The valley was too open, too exposed, the perfect place for an ambush. She spoke her doubts, her voice calm but firm, warning that the enemy's desperation would make them cunning. Some listened, but hunger and hope are powerful forces, and in the end the council voted to strike. Against her better judgment, Elira agreed to lead them, unwilling to let her comrades walk into danger without her. The night of the attack, the resistance moved silently through the trees, their breaths quick with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the glow of torches in the valley below. The convoy was there, wagons heavy with supplies, guards moving with deliberate slowness. Too deliberate. Elira felt it in her bones before it began. The silence in the trees was too heavy, the air too still. And then the valley erupted. Enemy forces surged from the cliffs, torches flaring, arrows raining down like fire. The resistance was caught in a trap as deadly as any they had ever faced, their formation shattered before the first cry of warning could rise. Chaos engulfed them, comrades falling in waves, the sound of steel and screams filling the night. In the midst of it, Elira fought like a storm, her blade flashing, her movements a blur of fury and precision. She cut a path through the press of enemies, dragging the wounded to safety, striking down those who barred her way. But even her strength could not hold back the tide. Blood soaked the snow and the resistance faltered, their victory turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Elira's heart pounded with rage, not at the enemy but at herself, for allowing this, for leading them into the jaws of death. She shouted for retreat, her voice carrying through the chaos, and her comrades followed, scattering into the night as she held the line, her blade carving through wave after wave to buy them time. The enemy pressed hard, but none could stand against her fury. Soldiers who had sworn to end her trembled as she cut them down, her eyes blazing with a fire that no fear could quench. At last, when the survivors had fled beyond reach, she slipped into the shadows, vanishing like smoke before the enemy's grasp. The valley burned with their false victory, but the cost was heavy. Dozens of her comrades lay dead, their bodies lost among the wagons and the flames. The resistance was broken, scattered, and Elira carried the weight of it on her shoulders like chains. That night, she did not sit with the others, did not whisper names into the firelight. She walked alone into the forest, her blade dragging in the dirt, her heart a storm of grief and fury. They had called her a tagalong once, and she had borne it in silence. Now they called her a phantom, a curse upon the enemy, a leader they could not live without. But in that moment, as the wind carried the stench of blood through the trees, she felt neither phantom nor leader, only the same girl who had hidden under the floorboards, powerless to stop the fire that consumed everything she loved. And yet, as she lifted her gaze to the stars, her vow burned stronger than ever. She would not stop. She could not. Because the enemy had not yet learned the full truth of the name they feared, and she would make certain they never forgot. The days after the Valley Massacre were heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of small campfires and the distant cries of crows circling where bodies lay unburied. The resistance had been shattered, their numbers halved, their confidence wounded deeper than any sword could cut. They looked to Elira not with blame but with a kind of desperate expectation, as though the mere fact that she had survived meant she carried a secret path back from ruin. Yet Elira herself walked like a shadow among them, her shoulders bowed beneath a weight no one else could see. She did not speak of strategy, did not lift her voice to rally them, for her own heart was still raw with grief, her thoughts haunted by the faces of those she could not save. At night, when the camp sank into uneasy slumber, she wandered alone, her blade dragging against the stones as though to remind herself it was still real, still hers, still sharp enough to cut through the veil of despair. One night, as she sat by a dying fire, a boy no older than 15 approached her, his arm in a crude sling, his eyes wide and uncertain. He knelt beside her without speaking, his gaze fixed on the flames. After a long silence he whispered, "My brother died in the valley. He told me to follow you because you would never let us fall. Was he wrong?" The words pierced her deeper than any blade, and for a moment she could not breathe. She turned to the boy, saw the reflection of firelight in his eyes, saw the echo of countless others who had looked at her the same way, with hope that felt like chains. Slowly she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice rough. "Your brother was not wrong. We fell but we are not broken. And as long as I breathe I will not let you be." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, as though those few words had given him enough strength to last another day. It was then Elira understood that her grief could no longer be hers alone to carry. If she let it consume her, so too would it consume all of them. She had to rise again, not for herself but for the weight of every life that had been placed in her hands. The next morning she stood before the survivors, her expression hard, her gaze unyielding. "We lost," she said plainly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We bled and they think they've broken us. But they haven't. They've only taught us how much we have left to fight for. We cannot undo what has happened, but we can make them pay for every drop of blood they've spilled." Her words were not grand, not gilded with promises of easy victory, but they carried the sharp edge of truth. The resistance stirred, their eyes finding fire again, and though their numbers were fewer, their resolve hardened. They had survived worse winters, and if Elira still stood, so too would they. With renewed determination, Elira led them deeper into the forests, abandoning their scattered camps for hidden strongholds and caves and ruins. They became ghosts once more, moving with silence, striking with precision, retreating before the enemy could strike back. This time, Elira allowed no temptation to lure them into open battle. Every move was calculated, every strike designed not to win ground but to bleed the enemy slowly, to drain their strength drop by drop until their vast armies became hollow shells of fear. Weeks turned into months and the enemy's grip began to loosen. Villages once too terrified to resist now rose in defiance, emboldened by tales of Elira's vengeance. Supplies dwindled in the enemy camps, patrols vanished into forests from which they never returned, and whispers of mutiny spread through their ranks. Still, the enemy generals refused to admit defeat, their pride greater than their reason, and they tightened their hold, squeezing the land until it suffocated. Elira knew this could not last. Shadows and raids would not end the war, only prolong it, and the longer it stretched, the more her people would suffer. To break the enemy once and for all, something greater was needed, a blow so decisive it would tear the heart from their command. The chance came sooner than she expected. Scouts returned with word that the enemy's high general himself had arrived to oversee the campaign, bringing with him the war chest, the gold and supplies that fed the armies crushing the land. If the general fell, and the treasure with him, the enemy's campaign would collapse, their soldiers left leaderless and starving. It was the risk of a lifetime, perhaps even suicide, but Elira felt the fire in her blood ignite. This was the moment she had been forged for, the reason fate had spared her in the ruins of her village. She gathered her fighters, laid out the plan with the calm precision of a hunter setting traps, and when she was finished, there was no fear in their eyes, only trust. On the night of the strike, the moon was a thin sliver, barely enough to light the forest paths. The resistance moved like shadows, every footfall measured, every breath held as though the trees themselves listened. At the heart of the valley lay the enemy camp, sprawling with tents and banners, torches flickering like fireflies across the dark. Elira led the way, her blade drawn but silent, her eyes fixed on the largest tent at the center, where the general's banner fluttered in the night wind. The attack came swift and merciless. Fires bloomed across the camp as oil-soaked arrows found their mark, shouts erupted in confusion, and panic spread before the soldiers even knew where the enemy was. Elira's fighters struck from all sides, cutting down guards, seizing supplies, scattering horses into chaos. Amid the storm, Elira herself drove straight for the general's tent, cutting down any who stood before her with a fury that made even hardened soldiers falter. She burst into the pavilion to find the general already armed, a man scarred by years of war, his eyes burning with hatred. "So you are the Phantom," he sneered, drawing his blade. "Tonight your shadow ends." Elira said nothing. She raised her sword and the clash began. Steel rang in the night, sparks flying with every strike, their blades moving with the speed of years honed by survival. The general was strong, his blows heavy enough to shake her arms, but Elira was faster, her movements sharp as lightning, born of countless battles in forest and ruin. They fought in silence, save for the clash of steel and the ragged breaths between strikes, until at last Elira found her opening. With a swift turn, she drove her blade through the gap in his armor, piercing his chest. The general staggered, eyes wide with shock, blood spilling from his lips as he fell to his knees. Elira stood over him, her expression cold, her silence more terrible than any curse. With a final strike, she ended him. Outside, the camp was in chaos, enemy soldiers fleeing in panic as the resistance set fire to the war chest, gold and supplies erupting into flames that lit the night sky like a beacon. Victory was theirs, not just a raid but a death blow to the heart of the enemy. The resistance withdrew before reinforcements could arrive, vanishing once more into the forests, leaving behind only ashes and the body of a fallen general. When dawn broke, the enemy's banners no longer flew with pride but drooped in silence, their soldiers demoralized, their campaign crumbling. Word spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of peasants and soldiers alike. The Phantom had slain the general and the tide of war had turned. For the first time in years, hope rose across the land like the sun after a storm. Yet Elira felt no triumph, only a quiet weariness that settled into her bones. She had delivered the blow they needed, but she knew the war was not yet finished. Shadows still waited on the horizon, and her path was far from over. Still, as she looked at the faces of her comrades, weary but alive, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles, a flicker of warmth in the cold. For now, the vow she had carried since the night of fire had not been broken, and the world would remember that even in its darkest hour, one girl's silence had roared louder than any army. The death of the general spread through the enemy ranks like a plague, dissolving order into chaos, breeding distrust among officers, and sowing despair in the soldiers who had once marched with pride. Villages that had long suffered under their yoke began to rise, emboldened by the stories of the Phantom girl who had struck down the heart of the enemy with her own hand. For the resistance, it was a rebirth, a turning of tides they had never dared to imagine. Yet for Elira it was not victory but another weight, another chapter in a story she had not chosen but could not abandon. She had slain the general, yes, but she knew too well that empires did not crumble with a single cut. Others would come, hungrier, crueler, eager to avenge their fallen leader and restore the pride of their banners. So while the land whispered her name in awe and gratitude, she walked with the same silence as before, her eyes fixed always on the horizon, where danger smoldered like coals that refused to die. The months that followed were unlike any she had known. For the first time the resistance no longer simply survived, they advanced. Villages joined them willingly, men and women offering their arms, their homes, their food. Children once too frightened to speak of rebellion now carved her likeness into the bark of trees, whispering that she was more than mortal, that she was the spirit of vengeance itself. Elira saw these things and felt the stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Fear, not of the enemy but of what she was becoming in their eyes. She had set out to keep a vow to her family, to fight so their deaths would not be forgotten, but now she was more than a fighter. She was a symbol, one too large for her small shoulders, and she wondered how long she could bear it before it crushed her. Still, she pressed forward, because to falter now would mean betraying not only her vow but every soul who had placed their hope in her silence. The enemy, desperate to reclaim the lands slipping from their grasp, launched a campaign of terror meant to break that hope. Villages were burned, fields salted, innocents slaughtered as examples. Yet where their cruelty struck, Elira struck harder, leading ambushes that cut their columns apart, raids that turned their supply lines into graveyards, assassinations that left their officers bleeding in their tents. Each act of vengeance spread faster than fire, and the enemy came to dread the night, for they never knew when the phantom would descend. Soldiers deserted in droves, and those who remained fought with eyes wide with terror, seeing her in every shadow. Commanders argued, morale rotted, and slowly the invaders began to withdraw, not in orderly retreat but in disarray, chased not by armies but by fear. But with every strike, every victory, Elira felt her soul fray at the edges. Blood clung to her hands like a second skin, and even in moments of stillness she could hear the clash of steel, the screams of the dying. She wondered if she had become the very thing she fought against, a weapon so honed by violence that there was nothing left beneath the blade. Her comrades saw her as untouchable, unbreakable, but in the quiet hours she knew she was neither. She was only human, and humans could bleed, could break, could fall. The thought haunted her, yet she carried it like she carried her sword, with steady, unyielding hands, because to let go now would mean surrendering everything. One evening, as the resistance camped in the ruins of an old fortress, a messenger arrived with news that the enemy's high council had declared her the greatest threat to their empire, placing a bounty on her head so vast that it could buy entire cities. Assassins, mercenaries, even deserters from her own side would be tempted to claim it. Whispers ran through the camp, fear that their phantom leader might be hunted down, but Elira only nodded, her face unreadable. To her it was no surprise. If the enemy feared her enough to paint her as their greatest enemy, then she was striking where it hurt. Still, she felt a chill creep through her veins, not from the threat of death but from the realization that her vow had grown into something she no longer controlled. She had become not just a fighter but a symbol of defiance that no empire could tolerate, and symbols were always hunted until they were broken. And so the hunt began. Assassins crept through the night, mercenaries stalked the forests, and every battle seemed to bring with it a blade aimed not at the resistance but at her. Yet each time she survived, not through luck but through the same steel and silence that had carried her this far. Her comrades shielded her with their lives, refusing to let the enemy claim the heart of their rebellion, and with each failed attempt her legend grew darker, more untouchable. Still, the strain was there, etched into the lines of her face, carved into the exhaustion in her eyes. She had become the hunted as much as the hunter, and she wondered how long such a balance could last before it shattered. The final blow came not from an assassin's blade but from within. One of her closest companions, a man who had fought beside her since the first days of the resistance, betrayed her, lured by the bounty and the promise of safety. He led her into an ambush, believing that even if she died, the rebellion would survive on her legend. But betrayal is a fire that burns deeper than any wound, and though Elira survived the ambush, striking down her companion with her own trembling hands, the scar it left was invisible, carved into her heart. Trust became harder, her silence heavier, yet still she carried on for she had no choice. The rebellion had grown too large to stop, too many lives tethered to her name, too much hope invested in her shadow. She faltered they all would. And so, she rose from betrayal with the same grim determination she had risen from fire and ashes years before. As winter gave way to spring and the enemy retreated farther with each passing week, the land began to breathe again. Fields were sown, children laughed where once they cried, and the resistance found themselves no longer merely fighting for survival but shaping the dawn of freedom. Yet Elira remained distant, watchful, a figure half in the world of the living and half in the shadows she had created. She knew the war was not truly over, that empires did not die so easily, but for now the tide had turned. And when she stood upon the ridges overlooking the valleys that had once been drowned in blood and fire, she allowed herself a single thought, that her vow had not been in vain, that her family's voices, wherever they were, could rest knowing she had carried their memory into something greater than herself. They had called her a tag-along once, a girl too small to matter, but now her name carried across the land like thunder, and even in the halls of the enemy, it was spoken not with mockery but with fear. And though she carried no crown, no title, she was queen of the shadows, ruler of silence, the blade that no army could kill. For she was Elira, the phantom who rose from ashes, and the enemy trembled at hearing her name. The war that had once seemed endless at last began to wither, not with a single grand battle but with 1,000 small collapses. The enemy who had once marched across the land like a storm, now retreated step by step, their banners falling into mud, their soldiers deserting in droves, their commanders tearing each other apart in desperation. Villages they had occupied for years opened their gates to the resistance, and the people welcomed Elira not as a stranger but as the living breath of their freedom. They laid flowers at her feet, sang songs of her victories, carved her likeness into wood and stone. Yet Elira accepted none of it. She walked among them in silence, eyes lowered, her heart too heavy for celebration. For though the land was free, the shadows within her remained, and she knew peace was not something she could carry in her hands as easily as a blade. She had become more than herself, more than a girl with a vow, more than even the phantom whispered in fear. She was a legend now, and legends did not rest, did not sleep, did not fade into quiet lives. Legends endured, whether the person within them could endure or not. Still, she stayed with her people long enough to see the first breaths of healing. Fields once burned now blossomed green again, children played where once there had been ash, and laughter began to echo in streets that had long known only silence. The resistance disbanded slowly, fighters returning to their homes, some for the first time in years. Many came to her, asking what she would do now, if she would lead them into a new age, if she would sit at the head of councils and decide the future of the land. But Elira only shook her head. "I am no ruler," she said quietly. "I am no queen. I am only what I had to become." Her words confused them, saddened them even, for they wanted her to remain the anchor of their hope. But she knew that to bind herself to thrones or councils would be to betray the vow that had shaped her path. She had fought not for power but for memory, not for crowns but for the voices that had been silenced in fire. And so, when the land finally breathed freely, she prepared to leave it behind. On the morning of her departure, she walked through the village where the rebellion had first taken root, the streets lined with those who had survived, their eyes wide with reverence and sorrow. They wanted to stop her, to plead for her to stay, but none dared, for her silence was more commanding than any speech. She carried only her blade and a small pack, the weight of years reduced to a few simple things. When she reached the edge of the forest, she paused, turned once to look at the land she had bled for. The fields, the villages, the mountains beyond, all of it lay bathed in the golden light of dawn. For the first time in years, it was not choked by smoke or shadow. She allowed herself a single breath, deep and steady, and then she stepped into the trees, her figure swallowed by the green, as though she had been nothing more than a dream. In the years that followed, stories of her only grew. Some said she wandered distant lands, carrying her blade against new tyrannies. Others whispered she had vanished into the mountains, living among the ghosts of her family, waiting for the day the world would need her again. Children told tales around fires, swearing that if you spoke her name too loudly in the dark, she would appear, her eyes burning, her silence cutting sharper than steel. To the enemy, her name remained a curse, a reminder of their defeat, a scar they could never heal. To her people, it was a prayer, a promise that even in the darkest night, there was one who would never let them fall. And though none knew where she walked, her presence lingered like a shadow across the land, shaping its stories, its songs, its very heartbeat. Elira herself never sought such immortality. She carried her vow still, each day another step in its fulfillment, each night another reminder of the voices she had sworn to honor. The world might have called her a phantom, a legend, a queen of shadows, but to her she was still only the girl who had once been called a tag-along, who had followed others until there was no one left to follow, who had been forged by fire and grief into something unbreakable. She knew she would never find peace in quiet lives or soft laughter, but she accepted it, for the path she had walked was never meant to lead her there. Her peace was in the silence after battle, in the breath of a people free, in the knowledge that her family's memory would live not only in her heart but in the hearts of a nation. And so, wherever she walked, through mountains, forests, distant lands, she carried that silence with her, a silence that spoke louder than thunder, sharper than steel, heavier than crowns. A silence that the world would never forget. They had once mocked her, dismissed her, called her a tag-along unworthy of notice. But now, long after the war had ended, long after her figure had vanished into legend, the truth remained unshakable. The enemy trembled at hearing her name, and the world itself bent to the echo of her silence. The end.